Welcome back to the Comfy Chairs, a podcast from 123 Limited. This is Kate, your host. Today's guest shared that his work is focused on helping people find their voice. And during our first meeting, we talked about the role storytelling has in making this possible. It's an innate human desire and a common thread that links us each to each other. I've had several guests this year in to talk about stories and storytelling, and have repeatedly shared how much I love stories. In episode 11, We All Have One, we discussed how the shared experience of having a personal story can connect and empower people. And then in episode 12, Constantly Narrating Your Environment, we looked at the role of stories in company culture and employee experience. Today, Thomas Wilson, owner and CEO of R&H Creative Advocacy and Storytelling, joins me to add a new chapter to my ongoing conversation about why stories matter to people and to work. I'm looking forward to exploring how we can use stories to create psychological safety for underserved communities and to provide a space for the expression and celebration of neurodiversity. Welcome to the Comfy Chairs, Thomas. Thank you so much for joining me. As we've talked about, I like to let my guests introduce themselves, so let's take a moment for that.
Hi, I am Thomas R. Wilson. I am a storyteller, event facilitator, business owner, um, advocate, writer. Your list goes on and on and on. I always like to tell people we don't have enough time for me to say absolutely everything I do. But I am someone who believes very strongly in the power of sensory friendly settings, as well as storytelling to be able to empower and help underserved communities, but communities all around the world, whether or not they're underserved. And I am also a big believer in the power of giving people voices and helping them to use them. With that, that is the heart of my work, as well as emphasizing the mentality that empathy needs to be in leadership more. We need to lead through it, and we need to focus on it. And we need to also live that as leaders and not just say it.
Can't agree with you more. That is definitely one of the cornerstones of the work I do as well. And what I hope is clear in the conversations on this podcast, that empathy is beyond important for everything we do. I always like to do some research. I love when I talk to other small business owners to go to your website, read what I can about the organization and your services. And what I found in my research for today was the mission for R&H Creative Advocacy. And you've got that listed as to advocate through shared storytelling that embraces mental health and world culture and builds up the world around us with love and compassion. Yeah, so definitely echoing that idea of care, empathy, compassion. But I'd like to take a little bit of time here at our start, Thomas, to unpack that mission, because I think there are, one, I want to understand it better, but also to start our conversation focused on those pillars of advocacy and compassion. So let's start with shared storytelling. What distinguishes it from other forms of storytelling?
So I love that question. So it's not, I think when a lot of people they think storytelling, it's often one person speaking to a group or
Mm-hmm.
talking, and people are there to listen. What I love about the idea of shared storytelling, especially as it evolves, is that it is not just the speaker who is telling the story, it's not just someone listening, it is an active participation of ongoing communication that involves everyone in the group. Um, there are so many ways to define it other than that, but the thing that I will focus on in my work is going back to that idea that I'm not the only one talking. I'm not the only one
Mm-hmm.
telling a story. It is opening up opportunities. It is encouraging participation. It is honoring what is said. And in so many ways, it is the focus that often the main person telling the story is actually one of the few people who talks the least.
Mm, hmm.
I love to focus my stories around incorporating the audience, or if it's Dungeons and Dragons, which I often do, trying to get my people to communicate on a level that they are comfortable with, which is another component, honoring what people are comfortable sharing and making sure they are valued and heard based off of that. I always like to add the word heard there because, I mean, especially with social media, with
Mm,
all of these people going doing talks and things, there's kind of this duality of with social media, so often people are monologuing,
yes.
but I think it's important to note that those people are actually seeking being heard. And so many other mediums and so many other media, the end goal is for the people telling the story to be heard, whether they're actors or otherwise. But we also live in this age where being heard, and I don't think it's necessarily because of social media, um, we are in this era where people feel less heard,
Yeah.
less valued. And I think the primary issue that I have noticed is the push for the self in the
Mm,
community, in the United States and around the world, versus the push for the community.
yeah.
Um, and so, what I love about shared storytelling is it brings that mindset back to the community. It brings it back to the people. And it also says, let's have a conversation and let's tell a story amongst all of us through empathy.
Yeah, you mentioned Dungeons and Dragons, and I feel like that is kind of the exemplar of what we can imagine shared storytelling look like. Um, it's not until this moment that I've ever thought about it being a good model for leadership and teamwork, interestingly, because it's positioned as a game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I think about the game master or the dungeon master, what you talked about, that's the person that a lot of times is doing the least amount of talking.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of what we want from great leadership, where they're there guiding. They're sort of serving as the person that has the roadmap that knows what's coming next,
Mm-hmm.
theoretically. But they're really getting their team engaged. And I know you do a lot of youth workshops. So, what a wonderful way to be teaching this subtle form of leadership to our next generation. That's exciting.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, I want to go to that next part of your mission statement, mental health and world culture. I read this as another way to talk about acceptance and inclusivity. How accurate is that? And what would you add to kind of help me understand?
So when it comes to that, it is inclusivity. I so I feel like for a lot of people, when people hear of events, they automatically jump to the idea of, oh, events are naturally inclusive. They are naturally designed. Anyone can show up. Um, but for a lot of people, that's not a reality. I think that mindset actually exemplifies how easy it is to forget about the neurodiverse, mental health,
Mm-hmm.
LGBTQ plus. I can't say all the letters, so I if I said all the letters in that, I'd be talking for a half an hour because I stutter over them. But there are so many people that, like, I always use the example of a concert. Concerts at this point in human society are a norm. They happen all over the world. They are beloved
Mm-hmm.
by so many. Um, but for so many of us, even without sensory processing issues, over time, there are a few flaws of concerts. There could be thousands of people. There is loud music echoing through often a poorly designed space for a lot of things. There's no safe space, which I know some people, when they hear safe space, they ought to go, oh, that's too much. It's not gonna, we don't need that in society. What I mean by that is not just a place where people can be coddled. I mean a place where someone can go, where they can tune back into the world, where they can kind of get away from things that they need. Um, and that's actually part of my work, is challenging, like, oh, safe spaces are bad kind of mindset. But the
Mm-hmm.
other thing is, when you're in a concert hall, there's also this very real reality that you are going to be around thousands, hundreds of people that you don't know that are going to add elements. And for the best of us over time, that's all going to be jarring. We're going to be burnt out. We're not going to sleep well. And so when I talk about the mental health community, the neurodiverse community, I try to illustrate it as think of people who would walk into a space and that music kicks in and immediately their brain starts to shut down. Like they can't think, they can't process,
Mm-hmm.
or they become distinctly overwhelmed and they're trapped in a space with hundreds or thousands of people they don't know. They don't feel safe. They want to get out, but they're so overwhelmed they can't navigate the city well. They can't navigate the building itself
Okay.
well. There may not be good accessibility features like wheelchair ramps all over the place or working elevators. That person is trapped in a space where they want to be, but they can't actively participate. They can't process fully. They can't get help because someone isn't there to guide them somewhere where they can decompress. That immediately becomes a safety issue, not just for the person experiencing it, for the concert hall, the people around. Maybe if they try to get a lift, they can't navigate the app well. And it's really boils down to a human component of this is not something that works well for me. And I think as human beings, we can all understand and appreciate those moments. So when I say working with the mental health or other communities, my work really focuses on how can we stop that from happening? How can we help make this a success? Even if it's 10 people, how can we make it a success? How can we help those people break down those emotions? And how can we make sure that when they walk in, they know they have a place to go? They know that they're going to be treated with respect. Noise levels aren't going to be too much. And people are going to know that they have someone they can rely on. And again, there may be some people think, oh, that's just too much, that's overly complicated. But the reality is, it's not a political or a social thing, it's a human
Mm-hmm.
experience. And as we learn more and more about mental health and learn about the or neurodiversity, learn about this rapidly growing because people are getting like section of humanity, this is going to be the way that a lot of things are going to move. And for people to have the foundations where they are in their community, they can then eventually transition to a concert. So it's all about addressing that human aspect, that
Mm-hmm.
accessibility aspect, no matter the diagnosis or lived experience, because we as human beings have a right, no matter what we live with or are diagnosed with, to have the best access to our communities.
Yeah. We're kind of naturally uh, going into the building with love and compassion. And I like the concert metaphor or the example of a concert because it is something that so many people experience. There's so many different types of concerts as well. I
Mm-hmm.
had to chuckle when you said, not the best sound systems or places that are designed for that. My husband and I went to a concert, a show, a couple of weeks ago that was in an old church building, which theoretically has this acoustic structure, but for the type of music that was being played, it was frankly for me, as an introvert, as somebody that likes quiet over noise, it was a little overstimulating as much as I enjoyed it. But it got me thinking about we talked about shared storytelling. We're kind of getting in the space of shared responsibility as well because, I chose to go to this concert that I knew could be loud. I didn't know how many people would be there. And so I have responsibility for that choice. But wouldn't it be nice to have more information?
Mm-hmm.
Like if I make a choice to go to a heavy metal concert, of course it's going to be, loud and raucous and wildly stimulating. That is the environment. Do I have the information beforehand to prepare myself? I'm curious, does that type of like sharing the responsibility for informing and equipping people, is that what you're talking about when you think about accessibility?
So that is definitely part of it.
Okay.
In that, like I truly believe that any event should have preface of what you can expect and how. Um, but another thing to add to it, I would say, kind of developing on that idea of shared responsibility is also the idea, um, and I think this is something that a lot of people don't think, and there's a lot of communities that are adopting this. But I think shared responsibility also goes into how events set up their events in modern day.
Okay.
Like I've seen so many town things, they have like a sensory space for people to go,
Mm.
and a lot of conventions nowadays will have a room where people can decompress. Um, and for me, when I'm doing my work, that I was trying to make sure I have that designated space. Going back to that though, when we think about how long we have as a society just assumed that these spaces aren't needed, or that there's this someone needs a space and then they're just out of luck. Within shared responsibility, there is also, in my honest opinion, just a rudimentary basic responsibility of acknowledging and appreciating human beings and our shared experiences. um, and so one of the things that I found within that, and it does falter in a lot of spaces, is understanding just basic human expectations of what a space is going to be.
Mm, mm-hmm.
I've seen so many more businesses and all these things incorporating these, but and making sure we can honor them, we can treat them, but also in accessibility, it's also who we have at the event. It's how the space is set up. It's also looking at this idea of how can this person process the emotional, mental, spiritual, um, even just like in that moment, panic level.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's and I say that because I'm a big advocate that accessibility needs to be expanded beyond just physical. Like for so
Mm-hmm.
long, we've just thought wheelchair ramps and things like that. Um, but it's also having safety plans. It's having ways for people to process things. It's having suggestions. I know, so I recently went to the art museum in Denver where I'm near, and so they knew right off the bat that they had bad lighting in some spaces. They know that they have lots of people. And I personally have a variety of migraines. The worst kind
Mm.
so far has been vestibular migraines, where I
Ooh.
get deeply dizzy. If people don't know what that is, I have a hard time walking after a while.
Yeah.
The rooms start to spin. But what I saw, for at this art museum, I wish I had known about it sooner, was they had blinders for people to help with the lighting. They had safety rooms. They had sunglasses to help people. And I will say, as someone, that was deeply encouraging, because the lighting of these art exhibits is one of the hardest things to deal with. Like this idea that lighting between different rooms can really impact someone. And so for me, that is an acceptance of the general consideration that people can give in the realm of accessibility. Um, but the other beautiful thing that they had, um, was they had little spaces set up in the art rooms for people to sit,
Mm,
like in
mm-hmm.
some of the darker spaces. And
Yeah.
like all of these are very simple things that should be a part of our society, but they all incorporate accessibility, and accessibility in and of itself is a human thing. And so, very long way to say essentially, yes, we have to think beyond ourselves, but I hope that helps paint the picture a little bit better.
Does. Thank you. Though I appreciate that you when we say talking when we say building with love and compassion, it, it's actually physically, what are the physical spaces as well? It's not necessarily the I'm trying to create something conceptual or nebulous. It's being aware. I love this, Thomas, because it aligns with something I was thinking about this morning earlier today, that it's considering the whole self. So often in public spaces, at work, which is my primary obsession and concern, we think about people's hearts in their heads, right? Like we want commitment, we want engagement, we want you to use your brain for critical thinking, for decision making, problem solving. It's really easy to leave out the other part of that, our physical selves. The head and the heart we're all about, but what about the hands? What represents our bodies? And I was thinking about this because I had the opportunity to attend a really great dyeing workshop yesterday, like using flowers and natural substances to dye. And it was so relaxing to be able to engage my hands, which I know as an art major, but it got me thinking this morning, just reflecting on it, that we forget that. And we leave out a big part of what makes us human when we go into the workplace by not considering not just the ergonomics, but how are we engaging this other part of us? And if we're leaving a fraction of our whole selves out of work, or to your point of those social, communal and public spaces, how can we expect people to be satisfied and fulfilled if we're always disregarding one part of that? So I really appreciate you bringing the physical design of spaces in for things that have to do with our senses. There are a couple of terms that we've been using, and I am a person that likes to define the terms and make certain that we're all using the same language to avoid confusion down the road or misunderstandings. There are a couple of terms, in addition to the one that I referenced in my notes, that we've used repeatedly that I'd like to make certain we're defining for this conversation. Obviously, neurodiversity, but then one that we've used occasionally is underserved. I want to make certain that we clarify that meaning. And then just in the last few minutes, sensory friendly has been another term. So please tell me how you define those in your work, and what you think make kind of the most practical working definitions.
Definitely. And I will say, even with my extensive years of work, um, I acknowledge that the defining of words is kind of this really nebulous thing
Yeah.
all throughout the world. Like I know many people, I like to say with lived experience, but I know many people in the autism community will just flat out say I'm autistic, or like joke about it with terminology a lot of people wouldn't necessarily like. So I would just advise anyone listening, take my definitions with a grain of salt. And I would
Mm-hmm.
also say, take them within the mindset of how I'm using them. Because what I'm going to say is probably not going to work for everyone. I am also not a person who has been trained in the like fully in the medical diagnosis side of things. Like I have some experience. But the first thing I will say, and I'll try to say this as loosely as possible and as vaguely just to fit certain things. Neurodiversity, if people don't know, that is a way in which the brain processes information. Essentially, it can be incorporated things like ADHD or autism or many other diagnoses out there. It is essentially at its very most simple, it is how people process information on a daily basis. It is a brain component that will, for some people, like if you're not neurodiverse, you may be really good at focusing at times. Or one of my more notorious like ADHD symptoms is I have really bad what I call out of sight, out of mind,
Mm.
where I will forget even people I love dearly. They just go into the void of non-existence, and then someone will bring them up. They will have a very wide diagnosis, but it really is a bone not a bone, a brain aspect that will
Okay.
impact how people process information. I will say sensory friendly, I can give a little bit more of a defined thing, especially because we're learning a lot about sensory friendly aspects. But within this world of setting up a space and creating events, it's a lot less. I think the term is innocuous is one of the word I'm trying to use. Whereas it can be clearly defined in a setting and be like established by a rubric. Neurodiversity is this very complex thing that we're constantly learning about and constantly adapting different mentalities. And there are many people who look at it through vastly different lenses based on their experiences. But sensory friendly, the most simple way to put it is it honors a person's visual, emotional, like as well as other sensory like smell, taste, touch. It's not overly crowded, or if it's more crowded, it is set up in a capacity that honors the senses and emotional components. But one of the things that I also like to add into that, diving back into the emotional, is making sure that there aren't like pictures of someone's fears or
Mm,
there's, if I had someone who was a veteran and I had pictures of World War II on the room, like on the walls, that would not be sensory friendly. That would be deeply triggering. The other thing that I would say was sensory friendly that people don't always realize is the elements of what text we use, like written words or typed words. A lot of people with sensory needs don't read well, especially if the text is small. You may say that's just a vision thing. Well, many people have a hard time focusing on certain sensory aspects. And it's really this, it's also growing. We're learning more and more about sensory settings. But the last thing I really want to emphasize is the energy of a space. I always
okay.
know when I say energy, someone's going to roll their eyes or something because it's a very hippy dippy term that's slowly being adopted more. But what I mean by that is how I treat people and how we set up a space so other people treat people. We want to make sure that we're greeting people on a personal level. We want to make sure we're interacting with them with kindness and empathy, that the events are led with the acknowledgement that if we have to adjust, we can. Because one of the core components that I believe about sensory friendly spaces is they are constantly adapting to meet the people who show up. And
Hmm.
you can't get everything, but you can adapt, and adapting is one of the most crucial ways. And then there was one other word that you had said, and I want to
Underserved.
underserved. That's another one. I know many people who don't like the term underserved. I know many people who do. Again, language is a very complex thing. It's part of the reason I love to write. I love to talk. It's constantly evolving. Um, what that means, to put it again, maybe overly simply, I would think of communities that are impacted by a societal or emotional or cognitive need that most people would not think of during their day or may not want to work with. So I often reference the neurodiverse community as underserved. That
Hmm.
is because, while there are many people coming into the field to work with them, there are many people who just think it's too much and they cannot do it. And that's okay. We have to honor people. But there's also people who refuse to accept neurodiversity as a thing, refuse to accept that those people need help by providing programs. There's also a wide variety of components like mental health or certain LGBTQ plus community members who have societal or economic issues. And so to really round it out, these terms of underserved, I use them to illustrate communities that need more support, that need more good people doing the work, but they just are either understaffed or do not have enough resources readily
Hmm.
accessible.
Yeah. I don't know that I want to necessarily go down this particular path because of how complex it is, but it sounds like historically disadvantaged
Mhm.
in some form or another, and being
Mhm.
aware of that. So I'd like to kind of go through and make certain I can paraphrase and I've understood the way you're making use of these. And yeah, definitely this is for our purposes, for the purpose of your work. These aren't necessarily the medical, technical,
Mhm.
even socio-political formal
Mm.
definitions of them. So, neurodiversity, it helps us to capture and understand the differences in individual brain processing of information. And that can include, and this is kind of a constantly changing landscape, uh, folks with autism, ADHD, uh, various mental health conditions. Um, I'm guessing like the kind of the rise in the understanding of people that are highly sensitive.
Mm.
Um, that is sort of the net that covers it. And that tends to be more with like a formal diagnosis, correct? But also understanding that everybody probably has something that we're bringing along with us.
Yeah. So part of the reason a lot of people don't think neurodiversity is a thing is because the net is so wide. Like there are people
Mm-hmm.
that just they have their own bias towards neurotypical and neurodiverse. It has been a historical thing that's been an
Yeah.
issue for a very long time. There will always be people on other sides of that. But yes, I would say that. And again, like I said, I'm very much, for the audience, just to restate, I am not giving a medical diagnosis,
No.
nor am I going to serve as someone's doctor and be like, go out and do this, medically
Mm-hmm.
speaking. Um,
Same here.
yeah. I'm learning more and more. Those clarifications are so important. But yeah, that is how I
Mm-hmm.
would describe it on a very simple level.
Yeah, I think it's such a fine line, isn't it, that we want to acknowledge that, uh, quote, normal, unquote, uh, is not as normal as we were led to believe, while also not minimizing
Mm-hmm.
certain conditions and diagnoses that people have.
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference between us all being unique and people that have, whether it's genetic or other circumstances that make them outside of what we have said is normal. So it's kind of a both and, but mostly, no, we're not all the same, and we have to be aware of, which is a great bridge over to this idea of sensory friendly. And that is what I hear you describing it as. It's this intentional design and planning, as well as execution of spaces and experiences to accommodate, again, this variety of sensory, physical, and emotional
Mm-hmm.
um, ways that people can encounter, again, those spaces or experiences, to be aware of the fact that there is not this um, really true baseline, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then underserved, it's communities that have been adversely impacted, because because we experience bias and privilege
Mm-hmm.
in society because we're human. But again, all of this seems to come down to awareness and
Mm-hmm.
respect at the end of the day. So, we've talked about a lot of different forms of diversity, awareness, respect. With all of that sort of understood and defined, what I'd like to go to next is advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's your work, it's in the name of your company, it's your passion. I'm curious, what forms, productive forms, can advocacy take? What actions should advocates or allies possibly avoid?
Mm-hmm.
And what does great advocacy look like?
So to start, I'll start with what forms advocacy can take. And I think it's so important to note positive advocacy versus negative. Just because I am a big believer that all behavior is communication and we need to understand that in and of itself, but not all behavior is good or conductive to society. And so I am someone who believes very strongly that the most powerful advocacy is peaceful advocacy. I am not someone who is ever going to endorse someone to go out into the world and riot or call for violence.
Mm,
I've experienced some very intense violences through my life. And having that knowledge and that experience has taught me very much to work to be very peaceful and very kind to people. Um, so I'm a big believer that peaceful advocacy is best. I would also say when it comes to advocacy in all its forms and how it can be taken, um, I would say advocacy realistically can be just about anything. There is so much going on in the world, especially I was at a training for an advocacy once, and this was at a time when there was a lot going on before COVID. And it has forever shaped my mindset towards how advocacy works, but also how human behavior work, which was essentially I'm not going to name what was going on just for the sake of being kind and considerate to all people. They basically said, if X, Y, and Z wasn't occurring, we would not have as ample opportunity to do the work as we do now. And so, in my mind, what that shaped is the best advocacy is seeking out the work that needs to be done in peaceful and
Mm.
like wise, like actively wise ways to empower people during times of great distress. And while there's all of this pain going on in the world, I would say one of the healthiest ways to do that is, for starters, not, I am a white cisgender male. So obviously I've had advantages that many people just haven't. That doesn't mean I have not had a hard life. I have had a very hard life. But I think a lot of advocacy starts when we start with the communities in need. We move our ego aside and start going, how can we help other people? How can we heal this wound that needs to be healed? And that's another reason why I actively encourage peaceful advocacy. It may be slower in a lot of ways in people's mindsets. It may not always raise it's not going to always get the news on your attention, especially nowadays.
Hmm.
But I'm a big believer that you cannot heal the wounds of the world if you are constantly tearing them out and making them deeper. So within that, I would say, and then like to start with advocacy, one thing that I would definitely say is again, we have to, as advocates, we have to remove our ego. We can't just look at the world and go, this is what I want, so therefore that's the best option.
Mm.
um,
Yeah.
I have run across a lot of people with that mindset, and what I find is that ultimately puts other communities in worse situations. We've seen a lot
Hmm.
of that actually happening in the world today. There have been advances made, and people have gone out and undone things that have created a great disparity and equity. Um, but what I will also say, like I do a lot of work within the Employment First movement, which is designed to get equitable work for all. I do a lot of mental health advocacy. I do a lot of accessibility advocacy. And to get started in all of those, and it's also, once we remove the ego, I would also recommend actively listening to people who are going through the pain that you want to
Hmm.
stop. It goes into the same realm of removing the ego, and it's going to be hard. It's going to hurt. It's going to suck for a while, especially if you are benefiting from the biases and the mindsets that other people are suffering from. Well, not suffering from, living with or dealing with. But it's so important to, in so many instances, not allow ourselves to shut off our acceptance that is beyond what we are comfortable with. And I have seen several advocates. It's why, as a public speaker, I always argue there is no perfect answer for one question. The human beings, there's a constant exploration of what is right.
Hmm.
But I've seen a lot of public speakers. I'm not going to name names because I'm not going to pick fights,
Thank you.
but you're welcome. And I have respect for a lot of what they do. But when I hear this is how you live your best life,
Mm.
or this is what I did, and this is the blueprint for X, Y, and Z, I hear that and I recoil inwards a little bit because even if someone in my experience, I cannot define another person's pathway to
Hmm.
success. And what may work for 1,000 people may not work for 100,000 more. And so when we're doing the advocacy work, we've got to keep that in mind and we've got to keep equity going for all people, not just the people we know.
I was on my phone for a moment. Hopefully that wasn't distracting because I was wanting something sparked for me as we were talking, and I wanted to go find the etymology of advocate. It shares a root. It looks like with voice, and the original, I think, Anglo French, Middle English, maybe talked about calling to one's aid. So advocacy is that giving that voice, which I love since that's kind of your purpose and not just the mission, but for you of helping people find their voices. Advocacy carries with it responding to that call. So we need people to have voices so we can hear them and we can respond to their needs.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mentioned this before that you work extensively with youth doing training and workshops. Um, Love that you work in that space with something like Dungeons and Dragons, so it makes it fun and maybe less intimidating. You know that I'm dedicated to supporting leaders. That's where my passion sits. So naturally, I want to ask your opinion and then talk about the lessons that people leaders can take away from our conversation when we think about compassion, intentional building of spaces and experiences, advocacy. What are the takeaways for leaders?
So a big thing, and I've said this several times, I always encourage, I always encourage empathy, act with empathy. And I'll be honest with you, as someone, especially with the community I work with, like just to be transparent, there are moments I have to remind myself of that. Like, I do not get to be mad at someone because they are processing what I'm saying wrong or
Mm-hmm.
other things. I actually love the saying that at least I think I came up with, which is just because someone doesn't understand doesn't mean it's their fault. I love to say that
Mm,
on a regular basis, especially working with the communities I do, because so often, and I think this is true in the workplace with many leaders, staff, all of it, like many people want to understand, they want to succeed, but they may have a neurodiversity or mental health component. They may get distracted for a moment. And so the other thing I would emphasize is please have a strengths-based mentality.
yay.
That does not mean you have to encourage every single thing your employee or your staff or your friend or your community does, especially if it's like it's hurting someone. But there is this real power in, instead of going, I like this, here are the 15 things that you need to work on, and then really digging that into someone, you can say, here's what we did, but here's a game plan where we can make it better. We can support one another and we can make sure we are all a success. And then the other thing I would really encourage within leaders of all kinds, other than empathy, other than that strengths based, is acknowledge when you're wrong.
Yes.
Like there are so many moments where I screw up, and I'm not gonna lie to you. I think the customer always is always right mentality has enabled so much toxicity and abuse throughout the world. It is deeply flawed, and there are way too many people who take that to, I'm the customer, therefore I'm automatically right. So I'm just going to completely derail and degrade your employee.
Yeah.
Um, but what we can do is also just within our teams, within our communities, when we screw up, actively seeking genuine accountability, genuine apologies. We can make sure that for ourselves, we can build a framework to work with people together to make up for that decision. But I can tell you, there are so many people who have responded to, even if I feel like, even if they feel I do not need to apologize. When I go into a situation, if I am late or if I've done something wrong, I will tell people, I've messed up. What can I do better for you? And within that realm, even before you mess up, you can implement phrases like, what can I do for better for you?
Hmm.
What do you need in the future? And what can we do to work together to make that happen? Those phrases hold so much power, and so many people will respond to them. And that in itself is an accountability that predates the wrong action. And that is so important to implement as well.
Yeah, you're talking about the building blocks of psychological safety in the workplace. That there's humility, there's acknowledging our differences,
Mm-hmm.
there is acceptance of the fact that we're going to make mistakes, and being prepared to have ownership, forgiveness, and a learning approach to it. Um, the strength based mindset, that that is amazing. It makes me happy because it's something, not only have I studied it, I've taught it. It's been a topic here on the podcast in the past. So not only does that make me happy, but it's just effective. It just works. And it's a way to celebrate what makes us different. Because if we all have the same strength, it's like everybody rowing on one side of the boat. We're not going to move forward. So we want diversity in all of its various flavors and colors and expressions, because that's what produces great outcomes at the end of the day. So, as a way to kind of end where we began, I mentioned some of the research that I did. I found your blog while I was getting ready. Um, and it looks like you use that space to provide, and you use it to provide daily sensory friendly motivation for your readers. I would like to share one entry that really resonated with me. And if you're at the end, and this was just from August 31st of this year, 2024. Today, may you find the kind of quiet places where silence rests, calm resides, and where you can settle into simple serenity. Thomas, something that your blog taught me very quickly and clearly is that kindness can infuse our traditional workplace concepts like motivation, like productivity, and make them not only more accessible for some, but more appealing for all of us. I really appreciate that. And I think that's one of the big takeaways for me from learning more about your work and our conversation overall, is that when we focus on the people that have the greatest need, we're actually serving all of us. Yeah, would love to hear your thoughts, and then if you have any kind of final takeaways as well.
Yeah, I will try to make this quick. Yeah, I believe, I very strongly believe, to the point where I feel like I know it. I am someone who works very hard not to generalize people at all, because it doesn't work. Um, but I really do outright know that if we created a world, especially where we just, we're in any instance, there's always going to be pain and hurt in the world. But if we started focusing on the community, started really challenging, let's be honest, would have been some very toxic traits that have been infused into us American society for a long time, not just for
Yeah.
youth, not just for young adults, for everyone. I really believe we can do healing. I really believe that we can undo a lot of hurt. I will say though, with any aspect of life, we have to be careful not to take it too far, and we have to make sure that we are walking within boundaries that honor everyone. I know human beings,
Hmm.
we are a species that takes things to extremes on everything,
We are crazy
even if we
like
don't
that.
necessarily, yeah, even if we don't believe it about ourselves, it is human beings do it. Um, but in that, a few key takeaways that I would say outside of everything that I've already said. Um, One of them is, and that's part of the reason I set up my blog, was partly to remind people of this, which is give yourself grace. Um, it is so important, so necessary. There are so many people in this world who have been taught to internalize shame,
Mm.
to degrade ourselves. I always call myself lately a functioning perfectionist, and I take it to that phrasing. As I know, many people have appreciated it, that my perfectionism is one of the most toxic things that I live with. And I like the word functioning perfectionism because it honors how deeply influential that relationship can be and how much it can hurt me. But through everything I've also said, give yourself grace. But if you are a perfectionist like me, I hope that through everything I've talked about, we can, you can reach out to me, ask questions, or even just start thinking about the ways that you can better serve your community through kindness, empathy, sensory friendly work. And the last thing I would say is a takeaway. I love questions. I could do a whole 3 hour conversation on my frustration about trying to get people to stop asking questions, and we don't have time for that. But questions are a pathway to power, and they are a
Hmm.
part of empathy, and they deserve to be asked, and we deserve to not just be able to ask them, but to have our questions answered. Uh, so there we are.
I hear you talking about curiosity there at the end. And if we fostered more curiosity, like healthy, respectful curiosity,
Mhm.
I think we'd be a lot farther on. Well, sir, I know that you have just a few minutes left. I just want to thank you for your time. I really appreciated this conversation. I love that we've been able to be very efficient as the high functioning perfectionists that we probably both are. And I really just appreciate the insight that you've shared with me.
Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe, leave a rating or review, or share it with others. You'll find Comfy Chairs updates and other thoughts on leadership and learning on Instagram at 123 Limited. That's ONE23 LTD.